Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be part of this workshop. Let me introduce myself. My name is Pujiono. I'm the Regional Advisor on Disaster Risk Reduction of UNESCAP in Bangkok. Today I'll be speaking to you with regard to e-resilience for sustainable development. There are several parts of this presentation. The first one is talking about the sustainable development itself. Number two is the risk that are confronting Asia-Pacific region. And the third one is the role of ICT in relation to e-resilience in that regard. Let me start with the first one. The concept of resilience, put simply, is the ability of a system to withstand disruptions, and should it become inevitable, the ability to bounce back on a timely fashion and hopefully also stronger than before the disruptive event. Now, the reason that e-resilience is important, there are several reasons for that. It is incumbent upon the ICT to be able to withstand the disasters in Asia-Pacific, because Asia-Pacific itself, by the virtue of its location, is exposed to disaster risks. Number two, ICT is an investment, so it needs to be protected, it needs to be able to withstand disruption and to bounce back. Now, the larger context of this conversation is, of course, the sustainable development. As you're all aware, sustainable development is some sort of global compact, if you like, among nations and other stakeholders to continue pursue the welfare and the prosperity of the world's population. Some sort of continuing what has not been completed during the Millennium Development Goals. There are 17 goals in the Sustainable Development Goals, starting from no poverty to resilient city and variety of other sectoral goals that you will become familiar or have been familiar with these 17 goals. The one that probably of your interest is goal number 9, which is building resilient infrastructure. And part of that is target number 9, where it says the international community seeks to considerably increase the access to ICT and provide universal access to the internet to less developing countries by 2020. Now, this is a formidable challenge to achieve this one alone for several counts. One is that ICT is a growing sector, but this growth are not necessarily uniform everywhere. Some are growing faster than others, some are more sufficient than others. But nevertheless, ICT is a growing sector, and this is making it very, very exciting. ICT could be seen as an enabler that accelerates the attaining of the Sustainable Development Goal. But as you could imagine, it also has a flip side, in which when it gets disrupted, ICT could also slow down the attainment of the sustainable development. There you go, ICT as a determining factor in the attainment of Sustainable Development Goal. Now, talking about the role of ICT in the Sustainable Development Goals, what are the essential steps to that? I think this is along the line of Sendai framework. This is a global framework that was adopted in March 2015 by almost all countries in the world. The first step is really to understand risks. What are the risks there, out there, and in here in relation to the ICT with regard to e-resilience? And on the basis of that, then having data and information sufficiently, as well as sharing some of the policy imperatives with regard to ICTs. The third step is generating actionable information. Now that you already acquire information, what will be the action associated with those information? The fourth one is customizing the information and reaching to the people at risk. ICT, after all, will only be useful when it connects people, when it passes information, and that information could be acted upon appropriately by people who are being targeted for that particular communication. And ultimately, using the real-time information not only to be acted upon, but more importantly, and this is the crux of the Sendai frameworks, the ability of the community to be sufficiently informed about the risk so that they could mitigate the risk if they know it, and more importantly, to prevent the emergence of risk itself. Now, as I said earlier, the second component of my talk will be the fact that Asia-Pacific region is one of the most disaster-exposed regions of the world. At the end of 2015, studies by ESCAP shows that this region bears 40% of all disaster occurrences in the world. And out of that one, Asia-Pacific region experienced 60% of all the life loss induced by disasters. It bears 80% of people affected by disasters and shoulders 45% of all economic losses of the world due to disasters. That's how important disaster risk reduction is to Asia-Pacific region. And therefore, in ESCAP, disaster risk reduction become one of the central themes that being given attention. Now, the risk to Asia-Pacific is not necessarily static. It is moving. As the society become more affluent, they being exposed more to risk. As rural community migrate to the urban circumstances, they got more exposed to disasters. And the more they compromise the environment, the more they are exposed to natural disasters. So these risks are increasing. While in the area of 1970s and through decade of 2005 to 2014, the damage from disaster reaches around $52 billion to 523. If this trend continues, by 2030, the annual losses in the region could climb as high as 160 billion a year, in average. That's how much that loss could affect this region. That's all hard-earned fruit of development. And people are increasing exposed to risk, and we predict that the exposure would rise from 742 to 980 in terms of number of people in average exposed to high disasters. In terms of sub-region, the South and Southwest Asia are most at risk by all measure. The South and Southwest Asia has a very high seismic, meaning earthquake related, and flood risks. Both in terms of occurrences and number of deaths show that the South and Southwest Asia is one of the most disaster-prone sub-region in Asia-Pacific. And it's also second most disaster-prone sub-region with around close to 500 events of disaster occurrence. Now, necessarily, disaster risk hits the poor the most, and that's certainly also true in this region, in which countries with special needs are particularly at risk. This includes countries such as small island countries and least developed countries that are disproportionately affected by disasters. Countries with special needs have low capacity and they have a very limited buffer to the disaster risks that confronting their lives. The country with special needs also have special challenges, which is true and through all aspects of life, which they have less access to ICT, for example, and space infrastructure, shortage of human capital, and lack of technical sophistication to make use of this technology. Now, this is where the Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway become very critical factor, including its intention and ambition to build the e-resilience in the Asia-Pacific region. This regional initiative was launched by ESCAP member countries. It talks about a regional broadband network covering ESCAP member countries and associate countries from Turkey all the way to Kiribati. It attempts to address the causes of digital divides to develop internet ecosystem which support the implementation of SDGs and to stimulate the digital economy. The Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway has 4 pillars, and one of these, let me just go through that. One is on the traffic network management, and the broadband for all, connectivity, and the 4th one is e-resilience. So e-resilience is one out of 4 pillars of the Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway. And that particular pillar, the e-resilience, consists of resilient ICT networks, support to disaster management systems. It means the utilization of ICT as a supporting factor to disaster management, and ensuring the last mile communication in terms of the transmission of early warning and so on that save people's life. Now I come to the third aspect of my presentation, which is the critical factors of e-resilience. The e-resilience become very important, and it could only work when there are several critical factors in the context of Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway. They are as follows. First, the ICT, in this regard e-resilience, could play a critical role in shortening the time that is required to restore facilities and infrastructure after disaster. Number 2, increasing our understanding and knowing the disaster risks and designing the measures to promote resilience. The third one, to make sure that early warning and risk information reach the people that we intend to reach. This is where the last mile of communication and information become very important, and ICT become very indispensable. Next, promoting the mobile and other communication means for redundancy and emergency communications. And finally, exploring the dividend that is offered by innovative technologies like mobile technology, GIS, space applications, and big data. These are all the critical factors that make e-resilience very important. I would like to present to you a table which is a little bit complex from the outset, but it actually have quite simple logic. That is, the e-resilience pertains to 2 very critical aspects. First, ICT in itself has to be resilient. It must be able to withstand risks. It must survive disaster occurrence, and when it's affected, it must be able to bounce back quickly and appropriately. That's ICT in itself. Now, the second element of that in the table is ICT as an asset to society. What and how ICT could become a contributing enabler to the attainment of Sustainable Development Goals. Now, on the right side of the table, you would see some sort of the aspects of disaster risk reduction, which is the important part of the e-resilience. The first one is risk prevention. Essentially, how to prevent altogether the emergence of new risks. For example, ICT in itself, instead of recovering from the effect of disaster, it would have been much better for operators and providers not to put their installation in the area that are exposed to disaster risk in the first place. That would require them to know what are the risks associated with the space, the area, the time, the seasons, and so on. Now, if one does not invest in a place that are exposed to disaster risk, and there will be no damage and there is no losses. Now, moving alongside to the right side of the column, in some circumstances, it is inevitable that you will have to invest, you have to locate, we have to situate your facility, asset, and capital in a disaster at-risk area. Then it becomes very important for the operators, for government, for community, for everyone to know what kind of measures are required to reduce and mitigate the risk from becoming the actual disasters. For example, knowing the season cycle, knowing the direction of the wind, knowing the characteristic of disaster that threaten the location, then we could adjust the way we operate. We could adjust the cycle of our workers' work. We could adjust the cycle of our operation so that we will not be totally exposed to disaster events or occurrences. Moving along to the right side, ICT in itself need to have preparedness. Now this goes without saying. The popular say that $1 investment now would save you $7 in the after event of disasters. Now this preparedness would include, for example, structural measures in which you have redundancy so that when disaster happens, you remain operate. You have trained officials and workers who knows how to handle disasters and so on. And finally, at the end of the spectrum, when disaster becomes inevitable, you will be able to bounce back. Now let's move on very quickly to the second layer, ICT as the enabler of sustainable development. It means that ICT should and could play a crucial role in helping society and preventing the risks of disasters by lending itself as a tools and instrument to have better appreciation of risks. ICT could also help society to mitigate disasters, as I said earlier, by providing information, by better reading of the natural phenomenon and so on, so that society could avoid the occurrence of disasters. Moving along, ICT could, and it has been proven to help society in responding to disasters. Look at the use of social media, the crowdsourcing, the open sources, to help society to cope with disasters, with crisis, with conflict. And finally, the role of ICT in helping society to bounce back, to build back better, to mobilize capital and assets to rebuild the society. So this is a table, very simple table that gives you the whole range of how ICT and e-resilience interplay in relation to sustainable development. My next presentation is arguing that, of course, e-resilience is not coming for free. There is cost and benefit associated with that. Like any other good thing in life, the ICT e-resilience require some cost. That cost has something to do with some consumables. You have to use SIM card, you have to use other charges. It requires system upgrade because the rate of progress in technology is so fast, you need to keep up with that. Of course, it requires operation and maintenance that costs money. It requires research time, not for yourself, but your staff and others, and also acquisition price. So all of these are costs associated with e-resilience, not in any particular order and not in particular proportion at this moment, but clearly there are expenses associated with e-resilience. Now, in terms of benefit, the e-resilience talks largely about two things. The first one is in terms of redundancy. That investment will have to allow you and your stakeholders to have sufficient redundancy. When you get disrupted by a disaster, you should be able to continue functioning. And if you got disrupted, you need to be able to bounce back quickly and better. Now that is in terms of redundancy. The second one is with regard to security. Now that security talk about system integrity now with all of these open sources and so on. The threat is left and right, and every second new threats are coming up. And we need to be up to date with what those threats are and what are mitigating and countermeasures to those threats. And of course, the privacy and data integrity. So those are the cost benefit, in my view, that shape the e-resilience. Now, the next part of that is that e-resilience is not operating in vacuum. As I said earlier, the technology evolve and revolve very rapidly. The options are plenty in the world. It started from digital option, the conventional radio, conventional television, and variety of other things. So in the following tables, I present to you some sort of quick assessment from ESCAP studies of the different technological choices, what are their advantages and what are disadvantages. And on the basis of this, then you could determine what will be the most viable investment against what kind of goal and objective you're going after. So ladies and gentlemen, that recaps several things in my presentation. First, I presented to you what the Sustainable Development Goals are. Number two, what are the relation between Sustainable Development Goals and ICT and e-resilience? The third one is the context that we are operating, in which the Asia-Pacific region is one of the most disaster-prone region in the world that necessitate ICT to be resilient. And the fifth, I presented to you the logic of e-resilience in terms of the progress of work, the aspect of work, ICT as itself, and ICT as asset of the society. And finally, the cost benefit and the options that are available to you. I would like to end this presentation now by inviting you to think through what will be the way forward from here. The first one probably is to enhance e-resilience through the use of existing and innovative technology. What are the options out there? What are the prospects? What are the forecasts? Number two, again, to repeat what we said earlier, to make sure that ICT will lend itself to help society transmit the disaster-related information and early warning to people who really need it. The third one, just like any other sectors that are affected by disasters, so every sector needs to consider how to make its activities disaster resilience. And ICT is not exempted from here. ICT need to make itself resilient, and only then they become useful to the society. The next one would be a challenge. How we could mainstream disaster risk reduction and resilient ICT into national policies and plans. Because those principles will only work when the government buys into it, when they put this into development plan and put resources for it. And finally, looking at it from ESCAP perspectives, what are the aspects that we could work with to promote regional cooperation? Taking advantage that one country is more advanced than the other, one country could supply knowledge and skill to others. How could we make use of this platform to achieve joint objectives and ultimately the Sustainable Development Goals? Thank you.